Welcome to our seminars of how to study the Bible. I'm grateful for all of you that are in the audience here, but more importantly, or just as importantly, we've had a number of people online, so we appreciate all of the participation. I especially like all the questions. I'm trying to get around to answering as many as I can, so please keep sending them to us. You can use the church website, and they'll get them over there to me. This evening, we'll concentrate on the Old Testament law. It's my intention to try to go through that, maybe get into the prophets somewhat, and finish up prophets next Thursday, and perhaps touch a little bit on Psalms and Proverbs. I'm not sure yet. The last session, which will be 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to try to tackle the book of Revelation. It always seems to bring a great deal of interest, and the last time I taught on the book of Revelation, it took me 6 months. So we're going to do that in one evening, how to study it more effectively. We'll see how well that works. But if you have questions along those lines or anticipating questions from that text, send them to me. I'll try to answer them as well as I can, and perhaps even in advance as I can. I'm going to run through a few slides that you've seen several times from me, and I'm going to do that because redundancy in this case is extraordinarily important. So, how to study the Bible, hermeneutics. Again, it's just a study of how to bring out the light of the Bible. That's the easiest way to remember it. I keep getting questions regarding translations and the choice of them. Again, this is a bar chart that put together gives you a little bit of a feel for where some of the translations fall on that chart. Formal, functional, mediating. Formal is a text tends to stay with the original language as much as possible. And you say, well, that's great, Howard. That's what I ought to be reading. Well, not entirely. The reason for it is that that effort takes away from some of the more usefulness of the modern translations. And you'll find yourself reading it, but not really feeling it as much as you would like. And I had a note earlier this week or last week regarding the King James Version. I always get that kind of a question. There are those who feel as though the King James Version is the only version that should be out there. The King James Version is an extraordinary text. In 1611, it's a bit old, and there's nothing wrong with age. And I grew up with the King James Version. So can you learn everything you need to know about God and church and your relationship with Him in the King James Version? Absolutely. And there's no better way to read the Psalms, perhaps Proverbs, but certainly not Psalms, than reading them in the King James Version. The poetic nature of the King James Version allows itself to, lends itself, if you will, to the material that's there, the poetic aspect of it there, the flow of it's there. But again, the King James Version did not have the manuscripts that are available to us today. So some of the nuances, if you will, that are available to us today and with some of the modern versions are just much more accurate in terms of what they're doing. So my suggestion to everybody who has sent me questions regarding that, find a text, a translation that's on the formal side, New King James Version, any of these formal listing that I have up here, the mediating ones, which is sort of in between, that's all I mean by mediating, NIV, NEB, and then of course the more functional ones on the far right side, the Message. If you're as old as I am, the Phillips translation is one. All of these are valuable, and if you read both of them, or can compare them, you'll get a much more effective way of studying. And you say, well, that takes time, Howard. Yes, it does. And I'm not going to tell you anything different. Reading and studying the Bible takes time. We have to move from the 21st century to the first century in the New Testament, and 800 years prior to that, if you will, from the Old Testament. It takes effort. It takes an understanding of what's going to take place. And again, that's not a simple thing to do. If you just expect to sit down and read a novel, the Bible, you're doing a disservice to yourself a great deal, because you're not feeling what the author was trying to present. You're not understanding what the audience was receiving, and you're not grappling with the issues that are there. And then, therefore, you're unable to really make an application to yourself. And that's important. And whatever you do, do not grab a passage out of the text and contextualization out of it without understanding where it came from. By that I mean, don't pull a passage out, make it applicable to your life, and presume that's what God had in mind. Understand what the author was trying to write, the audience he was trying to write to, and what they received, and the history around it, the culture around it, etc. Now that's going to have some real meaning as we touch into the Old Testament in a minute. That's how you really study the Bible. So, again, and I had a quote from Professor Stendhal, nothing overly important, but our vision is often more abstracted by what we think we know than by our lack of knowledge. We come into it with a preconceived concept of what any particular passage ought to be telling me, and you're not receiving what the author tried to write to his audience, and when you're not receiving what the audience received, and you're also not putting the applicability into your own life. What did I say last week? Yeah. The reason, what did I do, skip it? There we go. And I've said this every lecture, and I'll repeat it again. The reason the Bible is sometimes so difficult to understand is because it wasn't written to you and I. It was written for us. There's a difference, a significant difference. Because it was written to them, they understood it generally, the audience received it, they knew what the author was talking about, etc. We have to learn all those kinds of things. And so that's an extraordinarily important thing. And therefore, not all passages are commands to us. They're for us, not to us. I got to change that. We don't need that kind of dramatization. Exegesis is simply studying the language, if you will, and try to get the original meaning out of it. It can mean more than that, but that's a simple way of putting it. We go back in time, place, culture, and language to accomplish all of that. And this one I did last week on the New Testament. It's applicable in the Old Testament, and it's very important. I can't overemphasize this particular principle. A text can never mean more to us than it did for the first century recipients. That is, we can't get meaning out of it that wasn't put there to begin with. And when we attempt to do that, we end up with difficulties in terms of translation, and we end up with difficulties with the text itself, and we end up looking at the Bible, and usually you get the classic statement, the Bible can say anything it wants to say, it means anything anybody reads. That's not the case. But it is if we attempt to pull out of it a meaning that wasn't meant to be. Because it's a positive meaning, because that we can find it somewhere else in another part of the text that does legitimately have it, that's okay, but don't attempt to put it on every text. Don't attempt to put your mandate, or if you will, your preconceived thought processes with a particular text. Let the text tell you what it's trying to say. And then and only then can we make an application. So, where does the meaning where does it reside? Obviously, the author, if you will. Holy Spirit inspired the author. The text has meaning in it. And of course, the reader had meaning in it, which then and only then does it come to us. Now, let's dive into the Old Testament. What are some of the difficulties with the Old Testament? Well, first of all, majority in our brotherhood, if you will, tend to ignore the Old Testament. That's the first problem. We ignore the Old Testament because we have the New Covenant. I would argue with almost anyone that it's impossible to understand the New Covenant entirely without understanding the Old Covenant. Remember this, we don't have a God of the Old Testament and a different God in the New Testament.
Right.
From a historical standpoint, Marcion tried to write that in around 140 AD. A heretic declared that the God of the Old Testament was significantly different than the God of the New Testament. And he took portions out of the text, rewrote part of it himself, and the only good thing that came out of all that was it motivated the church to try to put the New Testament text together. That was their biggest motivation, was because the heretic had started doing something different. And you get a series of collections of Paul's letters and stuff, none of which is applicable right now, so I'll stand off. But now, the Old Testament laws are not applicable to us in the 21st century in the same way as the Old Testament era. And what do I mean by that? Even today, we don't have Israel going from Egypt to Palestine. They're already there. It doesn't even apply to them. God promised Israel Palestine, Canaan, if you will. And so authors in the Old Testament was writing to those people of how to do that. God had to transform a people that he wanted, that he had promised Abraham, which 1800 BC, rough numbers, that he was going to do. Your people are going to come into the land of Canaan. Eventually you're going to have this. And if you take the date that's used most often, Moses and Israel went into there about 1500 BC. It was a different time, a different culture, a different group of people. And the most difficult part about it was Israel had been in slavery for 400 years, if you will, following idol worship, doing all kinds of things, and he had to change that thought process. God had to change that. How did he do it? He did it with the Old Testament law. It is necessary for us to dig into the fact, and we're going to touch on a few scriptures that are important here, that we understand that God is training a group of people how to worship him. And that's why the Old Testament looks peculiar in some things. That's not being done today. Nobody does that today. But is it applicable to us today? Yes, it is. But we have to understand why it was written, what it was written, the time in which it was written, and then make the application to ourselves. The Old Testament laws are extremely valuable to us. The Old Testament laws are to be read within their storyline. So much of the Old Testament is a narrative. We think of in terms of a Leviticus, thou shalt not do, kind of a thought process, or the Ten Commandments, and we'll talk about those in a second. But it is written and fitted into narrative. This happened, and sometimes we don't get a conclusion from that. But we could if we go to the effort to figure out what the narrative was all about. And Old Testament laws are still the scripture. They're not the law, but they're still the scriptures. 2 Timothy 3:16. The Bible is a sword in which to cut thought process. And that only included, at that point in time, Paul only had, when he wrote that, the Old Testament in his hands. It is extraordinarily valuable to us, and it needs to be done. Old Testament application, the contextualization, if you will, for the 21st century, we have to take all those things into consideration when we do it. Now, do we have some weird laws? Yeah, we do. We have some that we sort of grab a hold of. We think, well, okay, I shouldn't steal, shouldn't cheat, etc. Those are easy by 4A. They're a significant portion of them, too, falls in that category. But we have some weird ones. And I've got one up there. Let's see if I saw it today. I had the wrong passage. Exodus 34:36. It's also found in Exodus, come on, Howard, 23. And it's in Deuteronomy somewhere. I don't remember off the top of my head. In chapter 23 in Deuteronomy. And it says that you shouldn't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, basically. And because it's repeated 3 times, and I've said this before, when anytime you get something, an author writes multiple times the same thing, it's very important. From that passage, you have some of the food laws that are instrumental in the Jewish teaching in Palestine today, because it has to do with dairy and it has to do with meat, etc. Now, that's an application that they've done. What's wrong with that? Nothing, but it's not why it was written. See, the reason that passage is in there is because the Canaanites were using that as an idol worship, a magic portion, in which they thought fertility would come much more effective if you had boiled the baby goat in its mother's milk. That's all the reason was in there. So what was the objective? Couldn't care less about baby goats or goat milk or doing it. God cared about his people going into Canaan and following after idol worship, which they did anyway, but following idol worship. And so wherever possible, it's addressed. Now, what are some of these other quotes I have? Don't mix up materials. Don't sew with wool and nylons, or they didn't have nylon then, but anyway, multiple materials. Don't interbreed different animals. All of those are not necessarily wrong for us today, but they were put there to try to keep the people as focused on God as he possibly could get them focused on. There's our lesson. We look at it and say, why did God put that passage in there for his people? It was because historically they were going into a land that was full of idol worship, and he wanted them to focus on him. He, after all, was living with them. He was in the tabernacle. He was part of them. And he wanted his people to understand that. And so avoid anything that resembles idol worship. So you want an application to us today? It's pretty simple. Do not go after anything that keeps you from focusing on God. That's the principle that's there. It's not elaborate, it's not overly difficult, and it is absolutely important. We do not have to go through a series of food laws that are being administered today. Are any of those really wrong? Probably not. But on the other hand, the very essence of why they were put down, we missed the point. We get all hung up on details and the precision of not eating X, Y, Z, and we see the 10th chapter of Acts with Peter and Cornelius. God, that's not clean. It is because I made it. He sees this thing. It took him about 3 times to get the message. And then he went to see Cornelius. Again, our perception and not going backwards as to what the audience received, what the author was trying to do, what the objective was, what the culture was, what the history was, keeps us from effectively drawing out of, for contextualization, or if you will, keeps us from being able to pull out of there and make it applicable to ourselves. Excuse me a second.
So is that where the Mormon guys get the wool underwear they wear?
Yes. And I'm not going to say much more on that in terms of the question came up, is this where other organizations look at scriptures and pull out what they ought to be wearing or not wearing? I think I mentioned last week, is it the 21st or 22nd chapter of Deuteronomy tells us that the men and women shouldn't wear different clothes, or they should wear different clothes, if you will. That's nice, but the very next verse, that's the 22nd chapter of Deuteronomy, and verse 4. The very next verse tells you not to build a railing, tells you to be sure to build a railing around your house. Are we doing that? Has anyone ever heard of that? No, not unless you read that. Why was it necessary? Because some friends would fall off your roof because the roof was flat, and they would get up there because it was hot, and they didn't want them falling and hurting themselves, so he tells them build a rail around it. If you're going to adhere to a verse before it, you need to be adhering to the verse right afterwards. Nothing wrong with not wearing the clothes and doing that. Just make certain you know why you're doing it. And again, God is trying to transform, if you will, Israel to a clean, unclean holiness, if you will. So that even mundane things, small things. How many of you have worked on your tassels recently? I think it's Deuteronomy 14:21. You're supposed to have your tassels, men, by the way, supposed to have certain tassels on your robes. I doubt if I've ever seen any. Well, I did probably see some when I was in Israel, but we don't have tassels attached to ourselves these days. The idea, again, was to try to transform this group of people that had been in slavery for 400 years into a God-seeking group of people that were going to go into Canaan and have to conquer it. That's what the objective is. Now, what have we got in terms of guidelines? Determine, I could have said the same thing about the New Testament, or I did, I guess. Determine what the Old Testament meant to the audience. Determine the differences and similarities in ancient times with us in the 21st century. And the theological principles of the Old Testament. Filter them through the New Testament. They're repeated a great deal in the New Testament. The Ten Commandments, 9 of them, are repeated in the New Testament. 9 of them. So the Ten Commandments has a great deal of meaning to us. Find specific ways, if you will, when we're studying this, when you're studying the Old Testament, to take the Old Testament principles into our lives. Not into others. It is not for us to look in there and start picking out lumber out of our brothers and sisters' eyes when we haven't bothered to get it out of ours, or splinters, if you will, out of their eyes and lumber out of our own. Look into your own life and see how the applicability of the Old Testament can be effectively make you a more God-centered person. And then, of course, you need to study the Old Testament through the literary, historical, and cultural context and read it as a narrative. I've said it several times, we need to be reading the New Testament in terms of paragraphs and not little tiny verses and chapters. It's easier to remember where they're at that way, but it's not effective. Well, the Old Testament is in narratives. It's in storylines. And it has a great deal to say to us on that. But the most important one, the most important guideline you can have, is to read the Old Testament as the revelation of God. About Him, His character, what has God provided to humanity, His expectations. That is the preeminent principle in the Old Testament, New Testament as well, for that matter. God is committed to humanity. He has been from day one with us in our history. He's holy. He expects people to be his people to be faithful and adhere to the Ten Commandments, 9 of which you'll find in the New Testament. Just don't ignore it. Or do the opposite. There's a small percentage that try to follow it dutifully as if the laws were written for them rather than written to them rather than for them. My pages are sticking together. Now let's look at this passage. I've underlined the part that really is crucial. You shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep fall, stay away, pay no attention to it. In other words, you need to do something about it. If your countryman is not near you, go take care of the problem. I'll skip on down the 3rd verse. Thus shall you do with his donkey, and you shall do the same with his garment, and you shall do likewise with anything lost by your countryman. You are now allowed to neglect them. You shall not see your countryman's donkey or his fallen down in the way, or pay no attention to them. You shall certainly help him. Now, I put that in there for a couple of reasons. Obviously, what God is saying, if your neighbor has a problem with something like that, you're supposed to help him. That's a principle in which we can make applicable to ourselves very easily. Jesus gave us a rather dramatic one in Luke 10 in terms of the Good Samaritan, where we found out who our neighbor was. You need to be helping, even if you despise, as some of them did, Samaritans, etc. But there's something else here that I want to point out. This was a principle in the Old Testament. It talks about donkeys. It talks about a few other things. What about the sheep? Is it we just ignore sheep? They had sheep. Are we just supposed to ignore other things that they had? No. This was a principle in which God is saying, here's how you're supposed to be operating your life. It is the same principle in which we can look at it in the 21st century. It doesn't mean that because it says donkey here, you can't go help with his sheep. When you're reading it, it's in a narrative form. It's trying to convey a message to them. Again, I've tried to summarize a little bit of this. The Old Testament law as God's fully inspired word for us. The Old Testament law is not as God's direct command to us. There's a difference, and it's an important difference. And I want to make certain everyone picks that up as we go through this, because it is one of the key principles in studying the Bible. For us, but not to us. Old Testament law is the basis of the Old Covenant, Israel's history. The covenant that God made with Abraham. The covenant that God made with Moses. The covenant that God made with David. And in a covenant relationship, you have a stronger power that at the same time is dealing with a lesser vassal, if you will, a lesser person. In this case, humanity, God with humanity. He's made a covenant with us. The Old Testament law is not binding in the New Testament except when it's renewed in the New Testament, which a great deal of it is. And we really need to be looking for not the God of dramatics, if you will, and from the Old Testament, but His justice, His love, and His high standards that we'll see in the Old Testament. If you're looking for those, you can find them. They are in the Old Testament. It does give us God's personality. Well, personality is probably the wrong word, but give us God's thought process. He's given us the Old Testament to get that. We should be picking it up. Now, what aren't you going to get? You don't see a lot of citations and whatever of referring to another scripture or what have you. That really didn't come about until the first century in terms of the Roman era. They started citing relevance in terms of a text or whatever. And you see a little bit of that done in the New Testament letters, not very much, but some of it. You really don't see anything like that in the Old Testament. Don't expect it. It is written as a narrative. It's meant to be written as a narrative. It's meant to be a story in which you understand and can can get the concept of what God was all about. The Old Testament law gives us examples, if you will, of expected behavior. How are we supposed to be doing it? Again, Israel, you're about to go into a mess. I'm going to help you take Canaan, but I have high expectations when you do. One, I want to make certain you stay with me. Two, you keep yourself focused on me. And all those kinds of things. That's what the Old Testament law was all about. It's complete, but it's not comprehensive. Go back to the passage that I gave you a while ago in Deuteronomy. Just because it doesn't say anything about sheep doesn't mean you ought to be ignoring the sheep. Doesn't mean you have to ignore the fence, although they didn't put up fences too much, etc. It's not meant to be comprehensive. It's meant to give you principles. And they were able to extrude those principles because they understand the period of time they were writing them and what it was all about. And the essence of the law is the Ten Commandments. Again, 9 of them you'll find in the New Testament. The Old Testament law is not cited frequently by the prophets in the New Testament. They write it down because they remembered the storyline. We do not get the little quotation marks and down and below in our text that a lot of us had to write, and citing sources in which we had. Again, that really didn't come along to the Roman era, and more so in 500 years later. Whatever you do, the Old Testament is not just a bunch of arbitrary laws. It wasn't given that way. It wasn't meant to be. Here, you got to memorize these 100 things, and if you do that, you're all right. There's actually 600 laws in the Old Testament and the books of the law. 600 items in which they should do and should not do, and etc. I sincerely doubt they can remember all of those. Could they remember the principles? Absolutely. Easily. Stay with God. Stay focused with God. When you go about doing things, do not do anything that resembles the idol worship of those people around you. Don't follow those. They did not need to get in as much trouble as they did, and you'll find in the book of Judges. But they did. We do today for the same reason. We start to lose our relationship with God. Again, the law is not a grouping of arbitrary, annoying regulations limiting our freedom. That is not the objective behind the law. A couple things regarding that. The law was written, as I said earlier, by Moses with the Ten Commandments, etc., around 1400 BC. If you want to argue with the date with me, that's fine. But use that for approximation. Other international countries around them had laws. Some of them similar. Hammurabi's Code comes to my mind. It was written in 1756, 58, call it 1800. Nice easy number to remember, BC. Hammurabi put it together. He had 82, 284, a series of laws. You can find it at the Louvre in Paris on a stone that's written down there. But it was considerably different than the law in which God has provided Israel. It talks in terms of class distinction. If you do something to somebody's servant and you cause them harm, even death, then you owe him 2 servants. And it goes on and on that way. It was a class distinction. If you were important, you got away with a whole lot of things. If you weren't, you didn't get away with so much. That's Hammurabi's Code. He was trying to fit his society in that. God says this has to be different. I care about the poor. I care about women. I care about servants. I care about you. That's what the law is all about. And in 1400 BC, that law is significantly different than the societies around them in which it was, in which they followed similar kinds of laws. Very important. God cares about his people. And the law is indicative of that. We've got some time. We're going to go into the prophets now. If you've got a lot more questions about the Old Testament law, and there can be myriad of them, I would first, well, you can send me your question, but just as important, pick a text and start trying to read it. I'm going to say the same thing about the prophets. Pick a prophet, try to understand him, figure out when he was writing. I'm going to tell you some of that right now. Why he was writing it, I'm not going to go into all those details, etc. When I grew up in a farming area, cattle, mostly dairy ranching, and I milked a gazillion cows every day. I knew every one of those cows. We had 150 of them, and when I milked them, I knew every one of them, what their tendency was, which one was going to kick me automatically, just try, and I'd avoid it. I knew exactly what they were. They looked like cows to anybody else. If you're somebody from the city that's never been around them, there's a bunch of cows, Howard. No, there's some Holsteins, and that particular one causes problems. There's some Jerseys. They give out better milk in terms of cream, etc., etc. When we look at these prophets, do not batch them all together. They're not all Holsteins. They're not all Guernseys. They're not all etc. We can't do that. We need to look at them and say, who was the prophet? When was he writing it? Why did he write it? Did he administer it himself, or was there something else that got him motivated? I can tell you always it was God calling him. Cattle and cows. Haggai is different from Obadiah. Ezekiel is really different. Ezekiel is different from Jonah. The prophetic texts are not always organized in our text by chronological order. And that's unfortunate. There are some translations, if you will, that have tried to categorize the books in order of chronology, that is, when they were written, and they're pretty good. If you want to feel for that, you can either ask me or you can get one as to when we think they were written and what listing that there was. It helps you studying it. Now, we have 4 different stages. Oh, I lost the slide. There we go. We have 4 different stages in the Old Testament history with the prophets. Well, there could be more, but I've broken them up in 4 stages. Let's put it this way. So, the 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Micah, Isaiah, were writing. Isaiah wrote right at 700 at the end. Hezekiah and Isaiah was a team for a short while. Isaiah died shortly thereafter. I won't go into the history of that, and we'll let go with that. The power base at that point was the Assyrians. A couple of different times, the Assyrians were a little weak in the early 800s BC. They become very strong later, and they were the ones that took the northern kingdom into slavery in 722 BC. So there's a group of the prophets that were in the 8th century. Prior to the 6th century, up until, I use a date here of 586, because that's when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, etc. He did it twice, not the temple. First time he did it was 605. That's when they pulled Daniel out and the rest of his people in 605 BC and took them off to Babylon, and he told them, behave yourself. Jeremiah went around and said, behave yourself, acknowledge them. They didn't. And Nebuchadnezzar came back and destroyed the temple. So Jeremiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Obadiah, Joel, Habakkuk. These were all prophets during that period of time. Oh, I should stop for just a second. We only have 12 prophets in terms of text. 4 of them is called the major. That's what happened to that slide. Anyway, 4 of them are called the major prophets. And we got the other 12 we call minor. Has nothing to do with value. Has everything to do with length of the text. And that's why our Bible, in a Christian Bible, is a little bit different than a Jewish Old Testament. No difference in terms of materials in it, but the Jews have collected the 12 minor prophets into one book. And it falls right in between the major prophets, you know, a little shorter than Isaiah, etc. So they look at it and read the material. They don't think it's any less. It's not has to do with value, has everything to do with the length of the text. And in addition to that, there's a number of prophets that were writing things down. And 2 come to my mind almost instantly in terms of 1st and 2nd Kings. Elijah and Elisha. Yeah.
I got a question for you about Isaiah. When you talk about the book of Isaiah, how do the Jewish faith handle Isaiah 52 and 53 talking about Christ?
That's an excellent question. I'll repeat the question so you'll, those of you online, make sure we pick it up. Isaiah in chapter 42, and then 49 and 52 and 53 all address a suffering servant. And 50 skips a little bit, but they're generally there. So 42, 49, and it's called 49 through 53. That's an easy way to remember it. A suffering servant. And of course, from a Christian point of view, and I told you this would not become a theology debate whatsoever, but from a Christian point of view, we tend to make that application to Jesus. And the Jewish group don't. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody. And so what do they do with that? They feel as though Isaiah, majority of them, now I got to be a little careful here because I'm putting words into some of my Jewish friends' mouths, but they feel like it was Isaiah that he was talking about himself in that passage. There's another message in which he was talking about as a group, if you will. I think in terms of the country Israel, if you will, as a group being the suffering servant. That is, you've got to put up with all these things, and eventually God's going to make him king. Or a kingdom would be a better way of putting that verbiage. Those are the 2 prominent answers that they have. They've got a half a dozen others, but those are the most important. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Good. I got one question done I don't have to write this week. All right, let's go on. During the Babylonian captivity, we had 2 major prophets writing, Ezekiel and Daniel. And I put Babylonians and early Persian in there. If you want a text to read that just blows your mind, besides the book of Revelation, read Ezekiel. He was quite different in terms of being a prophet. There's a point in which, and I think it's early in the chapter book. Yeah, it is. It's the first chapter in which he's sitting around talking to a bunch of friends, and an angel grabs him by the hair and pulls him into a vision, seeing Jerusalem that's going on at that point in time. He's in Babylon. The angel pulls him by the hair knob, and that's what it says. And so he could see what they were doing in Jerusalem. Ezekiel is different. And you can enjoy that chariot that he sees. Can go all different directions at the same time. I'll let John tell you how that could possibly happen. We have yet to duplicate it, but it looks like a good project for an engineer.
It's a flying saucer, UFO.
Yeah, but can it go different directions all at the same time? And the wheel's going this way and that. Anyway, that his chariot is something special. So the Babylonians are early Persian. Cyrus took Babylon in 539 BC. So that gives you a feel for it. And shortly thereafter, he allowed the Jewish captures, the Judea captures that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off to Babylon to leave if they wanted to. So we'll call that 538 BC or so. It's a good number. But Cyrus took Babylon in 539. Past Babylonian, Persian captivity, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and of course Persia was in the power base, and it stood for 300 years for 300 or 400 years. Oh, now I'm going to get into what I got ahead of myself. It won't hurt you to hear it again. The major is 4, minor 12. But the most important point here is the prophets weren't necessarily predicting the future. It is a term, and you'll look it up in your dictionary. The first thing it says about a prophet or prophesying, predicting the future. That is not what they did mostly. What they were today's, the 21st century preachers. That's what they were doing. God said, go tell those people to straighten up. And they went out and did sermons. You got to do this or that's going to happen. Things are going to get bad. They were the 21st century ministers during those periods of time. That's what the prophets really did. Less than 1% of the time were they predicting the future. Less than 5% of the time were they talking about messianic prophecies. That is, regarding Jesus and etc. 5%, that's all. What was the concern? It was the people at that point in time. Ask our ministers what is the biggest problem they have, is the people in which they're talking to at that point in time. The same thing was applicable in the Old Testament. That's what the prophets were doing. They were not self-proclaimed prophets. God says, I want you to go do this. And very few of them really wanted to. Read Jeremiah. The crying prophet is usually a term that is applied to Jeremiah. He had all kinds of problems. He didn't want to do it, didn't think he was capable. When he did it, they weren't listening. God says, yeah, I know. Go back and tell them again. They were the preachers in that period, on their period of time. Now, there's three major themes that comes out of the prophets. I'm going to go ahead and go through these, and I'll probably have to repeat some of them next week. Look at Amos, the 5th chapter, verses 18 to 20. I have it up on the board for us. And see if you pick up the problem here. And Amos is talking to the northern kingdom. What does that mean? That means 10 of the tribes of Israel that separated right after Solomon, etc., and split themselves up. They did very, very well economically. They were an extraordinarily profitable group of people. They had it made. The military power they did have, they were able to effectively use it. And so they figured, I got it made. Everything's all right. There's a lesson for us there, by the way. And so what they write to him, and what they were looking for was the day of the Lord. Because God had promised David that I'm going to put you on the king, your kingdom, and your group is going to rule forever, if you will, after a certain period of time. You'll find it in 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel, the 7th chapter. So they were looking for the day of the Lord. They were constantly doing that. They were very religious, more of a facade, but they were religious. And Amos says, why are you anticipating the day of the Lord? Do you know what that means? He is going to teach you what it means to be a part of him. Bad things are going to happen. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not enlightenment, if you will, not light. It would be as though a man fled from a lion, only to meet up with a bear. Now think about that narrative for a minute. Boy, I got away from the lion, he didn't eat me. And the bear says, I'm going to give you a hug. And you're done. As though he entered into his house, worn out, I made it home, if you will, rested his hand on the wall and says, good, life is good. And a snake bites him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness? Amos is writing around 780-ish, if you will, 775, 756, something like that. 722, the Syrians take over the northern kingdom and dissipate all the 10 tribes and take them off to Assyria, to Damascus. They were looking for the day of the Lord, thinking they had it made. They had all the money they needed. They were treating poor people horribly, if you will. They were treating women horribly, if you will. They were treating others horribly, if you will. The rich, yeah, they had it made and thought they were going to have it made forever. You want a 21st century message from that? We need to be doing what God wants us to do. We need to care about the people that God cares about. We need to be doing things for Him. We do not need to be doing idol worship. We do not need to be looking back and saying, God, I'm very religious. I come to church 3 times a week. I read my Bibles. I don't pay any attention to it, but I read my Bibles. And it goes on and on. They were religious. They brought, and I think somewhere I've got a quote on that, they brought animal sacrifices and etc. Am I out of time? No. Huh? No. Okay. The prophets called the people to a covenant relationship with God. He wanted a people, he wanted them to be a part of it, and the prophets were there to say, here's how you have a covenant relationship with God. You care about the people, you care about what He wants to be, you love God, He loves you. Get back into that order. Don't think you've got it made. And of course, it's applicable to our period of time with our government, etc. We should not be basking in our profitability. We should be basking in the fact of what can I do to help others.
Amen.
The glue for this is found, if you will, with the covenant in the book of the law. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We'll find instructions in there. With Abraham's covenant in Genesis 12, 14, and 18. It was a covenant relationship that the prophets were trying to bring back into relationship with God. And they were following about and eventually cost the 10 tribes from being spread out and never coming back, if you will. They called to God's eternal kingdom. He wanted them to be a part of it. He wanted them to be there forever. Look at Amos 9 and goes through verse 12, I think. Yeah. I will shake the people of Israel among all the nations as grain is shaken from a sheaf. If you don't know what that's a farming term, you put it out there and you get the good stuff out and etc. Garbage goes through, the good stuff stays. I'm going to shake them up. All the sinners among my people will die by the sword. All those who say disaster will not overtake or meet us. I put then in there. Then, in that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair. Within a couple of verses, God is saying, this is what's going to happen to you, but I still care for you. Understand God's mercy. That's in the Old Testament, not just in the New Testament. So that they may possess the remnant of Edom. Sometimes Edom is used in terms of nomenclature for the northern kingdom. There really wasn't much left of it, but that's what God said. I'm going to restore that, if you will. There's a time in which I'm going to do that. We don't see God doing that until the first century. And I got just enough time to try the last one. It's a covenant hope that's available. Look at Isaiah 9. And this is something all of us have heard. I know it's a couple of songs in the text, in our songbooks, etc. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time on and forever, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. I'm going to stop there. I will definitely go back over these. I would suggest that if you have questions on the Old Testament law, get back to me, ask me. Study it, and then study it some more. Find yourself a good study Bible. Look at multiple versions of it. Find a Bible dictionary and look at it. Even find a good commentary. Commentaries are excellent. Just go through that process first. Don't dive into the commentary. Don't take somebody else's word for it. Don't take my word for it. Dive into the scriptures yourself and see the meaning behind them and let it touch your heart and the motivation that you get out of it. And I don't have any more time, so I'm going to stop at that point.